Great to be with you. Yes, as the vocation director, I usually talk about priesthood, but I'm pleased to talk about marriage today. So that's what I was asked to talk about. So I'm going to say some things about marriage, and certainly sometimes when priests have talked about marriage, I've heard them, kind of excuse away the fact that they're talking about it being celibate and you're not having much to say. And I wouldn't make that disclaimer, because I think people who are celibate have plenty of things that are worth hearing about marriage, and I think the reverse is true as well. So I think those who are celibate can learn from those who are married, because in fact both marriage and celibacy, they're both nuptial. And if we don't see that, we're missing what both of them are. So again, just to say that I think that there is a perspective that those who are celibate can bring to what marriage is that's really relevant and important to hear, and the reverse is also true. Sometimes if you just asked a random group of Catholics what celibacy means, they'd probably define it as, well, it means not getting married. Which, okay, yeah, that's true. But of course, definition in terms of what something is not is the least powerful form of definition. Describing it as an apple as not an orange is true, it's accurate, but it doesn't say much of anything about what an apple is. So similarly, celibacy is not really not marriage. It's a positive thing. It's a specific gift given. It's a manner of giving one's self entirely as a gift, which doesn't that sound a lot like what marriage really is? It's the total gift of oneself to another, between a man and a woman. So we wouldn't define marriage as, well, not remaining celibate our whole lives, right? There's something more that can be said about what marriage is, and we'll try and say some of those things today. And what I intend to do actually is say some things that aren't really practical, but more a little bit theoretical. I used to help with the pre-Cana at my first parish when I was at St. Anselm's in Northeast Philly. We had pre-Cana, I think it was twice a year, and I was always involved in that. We had a whole team of people, a bunch of married couples, and they would reflect on different things throughout the course of the pre-Cana, right? There was a talk about communication, about finances, about all sorts of different things, very practical and very important. Those things relate a lot to married life. But then I would always be a part of it myself, and I would try and take it out of the realm of the practical and think about, well, what is this thing into which you are preparing to enter, as I was talking to the engaged couples. And in some ways, that's what I want to do today. So, first I want to say this, that God himself, this is a quote that I think comes up in the Catechism, it certainly comes up in some of the liturgical books, it says, God himself is the author of holy matrimony. And that's, I think, an important place to start, because there are a lot of voices in our society that think quite differently about this. But that God himself is the author of marriage is, I think, where we need to begin. It's not something that the church just made up, right? It's something that God has created. It's not something the church made up. It's not something that a couple creates by their love for one another. It's not their love that makes this thing come into being. And it's also not something that the government invents or determines. Now, the government has a very important role in marriage, and there's a reason why, even before the sacrament of holy matrimony, that governments and societies had a lot to say about how this should be lived. Because it's quite clear that the way couples live dramatically affects society. Right? So for a long, long time, and up until today, governments have something to say about how this ought to be regulated and all. And that's a good thing. We actually want that. But because we know that the way married life is lived so deeply impacts every aspect of our society. But again, it's not chiefly the government or our own love for one another or the church or anybody who just says that this thing exists. It's God himself who's the author. We got to begin there, and only then can we see how everything else fits together. It's first and foremost God's idea. It's his creation, his gift. And then that leads us to, I think, the useful question of, well, what is a sacrament, right? So now if you went to Catholic school or maybe learned along, there was probably this classic definition that you learned somewhere along the way, that a sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to confer grace, right? So that's being one of the sacraments. That's what holy matrimony is too. It is an outward sign. It's a social institution that Christ himself willed to establish, and the couple themselves become an outward sign to the world, and they receive this special sacramental grace, which is not magic. It's not magical, but it's real grace. It's God's providence alive and at work within the married couple. So it's a special grace given to those who are married to assist them in their vocation. Just as those who are ordained deacons or priests are given a special grace to live their vocation well, the same is true for marriage. And it's a beautiful and necessary grace. Okay, so here's a question for you. So what are some of the ways that the scriptures think about marriage? If you looked at the Bible, I mean, cover to cover, it's so much about marriage. But can you think of any of the ways that the scriptures think about marriage? This is your audience participation part. What are some of the ways that it thinks of it?
Right there in Genesis, that for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. The two will cleave and become one flesh. Yeah, great.
There's everything about that. What a rich understanding of what marriage is, right? Yeah, so that's back in Genesis. What else do the scriptures have to say about marriage? Yeah. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Very good. Certainly having to do with marriage. What else? Mm-hmm.
Husbands, love your wives, and wives, respect your husbands.
Very good. Okay. So these are a few of the kind of moments where it's talked about, right? I think there are many little moments like that, but then again, the whole of Scripture is actually from Genesis to the Revelation. I mean, the whole thing is actually, it's a story of a great marriage that we're getting to. But look at a couple more of those small things. You remember what comes up in John chapter 2. So that's the feast at Cana, right? And so that has something to say about what marriage is. Just think of the way that marriage is portrayed. It's portrayed in that scene as a feast, as a banquet. It's a beautiful way to think of marriage, right? It's at least one way of looking at it. St. Paul, in one of his letters, he's referring to marriage. He refers to it many times, but in one particular place, he refers to marriage as a great mystery, right? And it's not intended to be humorous, although I guess it could be taken out of context. But of course, mystery, as we understand it in the church, is not the unsolvable thing, the thing that's just so difficult and opaque and difficult to understand that it's just beyond us. No, a mystery for those of us in the faith means something where there's so much truth here that our limited minds, we just can't take it all in at one time. So he's using that word mystery to refer to marriage. We could use that to apply to a lot of different things. We talk about the Paschal mystery, because there's so much truth in the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ that we can't really comprehend it. We would use that word about the Trinity. Well, he uses that word about marriage. There's something so big here, something so extraordinary, that it's actually a little beyond us, even for those who are participating in it, right? For those of you who are married, it's a little bit beyond what we can fully process and comprehend and describe. And then, of course, going back to you quoted from the Genesis there, the sort of numerical description of what happens, right? The two shall become one, right? It's actually much more than numerical. It's about the relationship. It's about the fundamental what is going on here. The two people truly become one. Those are interesting ways to think of marriage. Marriage as a banquet or as a feast. Marriage as a great mystery. Marriage is a relationship in which two become one. A lot of rich ways to think about that. And again, marriage, it comes all throughout the Bible. Now, can you think of any specific marriages in the Bible? Who are some married people in the sacred scriptures? There's a ton of them. Abraham and Sarah, very good. Anybody else? Mary and Joseph. Who else? Tobias and Sarah. Yep, that's a great book. Adam and Eve, going way back, right? Mm-hmm.
Noah and whoever his wife.
Yeah, Noah, that's good. Noah and Mrs. Noah. Yeah. So King David, right? And of course, had many wives, but King David and let's say Abigail, perhaps. And then there's Peter and his wife, right? Because he had a mother-in-law, so clearly he had a wife. There's a bunch of married individuals. So let me give you, I'm going to list out a few marriages, including one that was already brought up, that I think are real marriages in the Bible. So one, I think, is the Lord and Israel. There's a marriage there between the Lord and Israel. There's a marriage between Adam and Eve. That's one we already said. And here's two others. There's a marriage between God and man in the person of Jesus Christ. The big word we use in theology, the hypostatic union, God and man in one person, Jesus Christ. And then the fourth one, Christ and his church. The Lord and Israel, Adam and Eve, God and man, and Christ and his church. These, I think, are four real marriages. I think the temptation might be, for a lot of people anyway, to say that, well, okay, of those four things, the really real marriage, I mean, we're talking about Adam and Eve. That's the real marriage. And the other things, they're kind of like that. But it's actually exactly the opposite, isn't it? Right? The one really real marriage, the only really real marriage, is the one between heaven and earth. That's the really real marriage. And it's the marriage between Christ and his church. Marriage between couples is like that. It's not the other way around. So, taking another example just to clarify the point, with Father's Day coming up, we call God a father, right? And we do that not because he is kind of like our human fathers. That's not why. We call our human fathers father because they are kind of like God the Father. That's the direction that this thing works. And just to make clear, St. Paul actually makes this very point. He writes in his letter to the Ephesians, he says, "For this reason I kneel before the Father, God, from whom all fatherhood in heaven and on earth is named." So just as that's true of fatherhood, that's what's going on with marriage. The marriages that we prepare to enter when we're engaged, the marriages that we live out through the course of our lives, they are reflections of the one really real marriage, which is between heaven and earth, between God and man, between Christ and his church. That's the really real. Okay, I wanted to say something too about the marriage. I have a wedding later today, so I'm going to go back to my first parish at St. Anselm's. There's a happy couple ready to profess their love for one another today before the church, and what a beautiful thing that is. And when you look at the rites of the church, there is something you can glean from that. We can always learn about what we believe by looking at the way in which we pray. And whenever I prepare a couple for marriage, I always encourage them really to look at the rite itself. When I was ordained a priest, I spent actually those few months leading up to it, I would pray over the ritual. You know, there's a whole bunch of things that happen in a priestly ordination. And I prayed with the readings that were going to be read. I also read the texts, the actual prayers that are used. And so that, on the day I was ordained, it was all very familiar, and it actually was such a freeing experience. Like, I was able to just be so present to this. I knew what was coming. I had prayed with it before, and there was just something really rich about that. And so I always encourage couples preparing for their marriages to do the same thing. One of the most important things that couples can do is learn how to pray with each other, and I think that's difficult for a lot of our young couples today. So I'll encourage them to take that, use this as the first opportunity to start with that, right? As you're picking the readings, don't just kind of skim them and, pick the one that sounds nice, but maybe actually pray with this one, and then pray with that one, and then pray with this one, and allow that to help you learn how to pray with one another. So I always encourage them to look closely at the rite, and especially to look at the vows, because they're things that are going to affect the rest of their lives together, right? These words that they profess in the presence of the church's minister and in front of the whole community, that's what makes them a married couple. And if these words, if that's going to be what we hold to for the rest of our lives as the moment when the two became one, that's something worth reflecting on. So the words of the vows that are typically used today sound something like this. I, Joseph, take you, Mary, to be my wife. I promise to be faithful to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, to love you and to honor you all the days of my life. In some ways, it's actually rather simple, right? The marriage rite is not covered with all sorts of extra things. There's something direct and concise about our marriage ritual. But what an immense amount of stuff is covered by these vows. Promise to be faithful to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, to love you and to honor you all the days of my life. So that, again, that's just very, very rich. and something worth reflecting on, not only as we prepare for marriage, but even as we live out our marriage, going back to that moment and reminding ourselves, what did I pledge myself to when we were married? They're strong and all-encompassing words, ones that I think are worth reflecting on again and again. Good. Now, all right, so here I will say something that is practical. A lot of that I think is kind of theoretical. To say something really practical, which doesn't come specifically from the catechism or from the scriptures or anything, but from a guy who writes from a bit of a sociological perspective. Perhaps you've heard of this Dr. Gary Chapman before. He's written a lot of popular books, but one of them is called The 5 Love Languages. Right. So I think it's actually, it's worthwhile. Again, it doesn't come specifically from some type of a Christian perspective, but it's worth considering in the way that we live out our lives as married couples and actually as Christians more generally, how we treat one another. So just to boil down the essence of the book, he thinks that there are, by love languages, he's not talking about Italian and French and whatnot, right? So he's talking about ways that human beings communicate love to one another. And again, that's why it's not just about married couples. It could be about a whole range of the way Christians love one another. But so he comes up with a list, and he says that here are some of the ways we express our affection for one another. He says that one is gifts. We give gifts to people that we care about, right? I'm not sure I've ever given a gift to somebody I don't care about. Quality time is another one. Actually, just spending quality time with a person shows the love we have for them. His third one, he says, is words of affirmation. Giving words of affirmation to the other. Fourth is acts of service. So not words of affirmation, but acts of actual service. And the fifth is physical touch. So, and he would make the point that, different people are good at giving these things. We're not all equally good at all of those. And there are certain ones of those that we prefer to receive, right? So that's kind of the whole thrust of the book. Somebody on reading, he thinks that list is exhaustive, but somebody upon reading the book suggested that there should actually be a sixth love language, and their suggestion was food. So something to consider. But the reason I bring it up really is that this is of the essence of marriage, that couples learn how to give and receive love. It's of the essence of family life, isn't it? We need to give and receive love. I think, with our critical eyes looking at our culture sometimes, I think it's pretty obvious to see that there's a lot of take, isn't there? And that's probably at the root of some of the problems we have in family life as a society. So we're a little bit too heavy on the taking side and maybe not enough on the give. Now, you can go to the far extreme, right? Where it's all give all the time and never actually receiving anything. So it's the mutuality of this that makes the whole thing work. There's a document from the Second Vatican Council. I realize most people don't read church documents, right? So this one document from Vatican II is immensely long, so I wouldn't expect anybody to read it. But I'll give you one sentence from Gaudium et Spes, what it says about, it has a beautiful section about what marriage is, and this is one of my favorite definitions, really, of marriage. It says, in marriage, spouses mutually bestow and accept one another. That's all it says. It says, in marriage, spouses mutually bestow and accept one another, which is another way, I think, a beautiful way of describing what John Paul II always talked about as the total gift of self. Right? It's a total gift of self. We got to give ourselves, but we have to receive. And the whole, everything about us, right? The good and the bad and the really ugly, right? There's no, in marriage, you can't say, I'm going to take all these good qualities of you, but I reject this aspect. No, it's taking on the whole of an imperfect person. And it's the giving of my entire self. Even with all my woundedness, even with all the things that are a little screwed up about me, I'm going to give myself entirely to you. And it's in that gift that something beautiful occurs. And these marriages between husbands and wives in this life, they are imperfect because they are a reflection of the really real, of what God is making perfect, the marriage between him and us, between heaven and earth. Okay. So that's a bunch of things about marriage, some of which is impractical, some of which is a little more practical. I try to encourage couples too, of course, we can fall into the trap of preparing for a wedding instead of preparing for a marriage, and that's not a good thing, right? but recognizing that marriage, our wedding day, it's the beginning of a tremendous journey, a beginning of a journey that's going to last the rest of our lives, and it's a walk towards heaven. That's the idea. It's two imperfect people helping one another to become saints, along the way, hopefully raising children to become saints, saints raising saints, and walking towards heaven together. And that is a lot more difficult than it sounds. It's really easy to say, isn't it? But that's really what we're trying to do. With the help of our extended family and friends, with the help of the church, with the help of all sorts of people. But that's the essence of what we're doing in these relationships of marriage. Good. So one thing I haven't said anything about, which tends to be the first and sometimes the only thing that people talk about when they discuss marriage, is sexual intimacy. So I'll just say a couple of things about that because, again, also indicative of some of the issues we have in family life, is that often becomes the only thing that's discussed, as though that were like the sum total of married life, which anybody who's married can attest. I mean, it's not. It's a very important aspect, but it's not the sum total. And that's why I didn't begin there. But just to say something about this, because, of course, sex is a gift to us. There's something of very positive good here. And, of course, people on the outside of the church often think that we have a different idea about that. But we don't. So what do we actually think about these things? We see the sexual act as the physical expression of this total gift of self. Total gift of self is lived out in many ways, and it's visible in many ways. But this is one way in which it's physically expressed. Those vows, when we make vows to one another in the context of holy matrimony, and they're actually preceded by 3 questions, which perhaps it's worth reading as well. So those of you who are married can maybe think back again to when this happened. But you have the vows that you recite are preceded by the minister asking you, sorry, should have marked the page. Mary and Joseph, have you come here to enter into marriage without coercion, freely and wholeheartedly? The couple says they have. Are you prepared as you follow the path of marriage to love and honor each other for as long as you both shall live? And they say that they are. Are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and to bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? And again, they affirm that they are. So those questions and then the exchange of the vows establish a few things. They establish really the goods of marriage, what we call the goods of marriage. First, that we intend this to be faithful. In an exclusive way, I'm going to love this one person in a way that I don't love any other. There's something that's meant to be faithful here, fidelity in all things. They also establish that there's a desire for this relationship to be fruitful. And that means both, again, this is in a richer way, but it means children, but a spiritual fruitfulness, not only the physical procreation, but the spiritual procreation, the drawing of more life into the church. So they establish that we intend our marriages to be faithful, that we intend them to be fruitful, and that we intend them to be forever, right? All the days of my life, we say, that this is an indissoluble union that lasts up until death. So those questions, these vows, they establish that this is what we're talking about. This is marriage as the church offers it, not some other thing. It's not a business contract. It's not about what happens with our taxes. Again, all those things are good, and they reflect the reality that what happens in marriage has an impact on the rest of society. But that's all secondary. What's primary is that we have 2 people here, a husband and a bride and a groom, who want their relationship to be totally faithful. They're open to it being fruitful. They desire it to be forever. And so, intimacy too, again, that word more often than not these days is used to refer only to the sexual aspect of marriage, but there is so much more to intimacy than sexuality, right? And this is, again, as a celibate person, as a priest, there's an immense intimacy that occurs between a priest and various parishioners and people in various ways, right? There's a ton of intimacy there. God created us for intimacy, and the first level of intimacy to which we're all called is a life of deep prayer with the Lord, and intimacy with him. So again, the sexual act is one aspect of the intimacy shared between couples, but if that's the only actual intimacy, things are going to fall apart, right? That intimate act needs to be surrounded by an intimacy where two hearts are actually have become one, where they have shared themselves with one another in so many other ways. So we kind of classically refer to two particular aspects of what's necessary in a sexual act, right? That it be both desiring the unity of the couple, and also procreation. Both things at the same time. That these are two aspects. There's the unitive and the procreative dimensions of marital sexuality, and that divorcing one from the other does violence to what this great gift is and is meant to be. So that's what I wanted to say about that. And I'm sorry if it seems a little scattered, but the last thing I wanted to do is to share with you what's called the exhortation. It's a beautiful reflection on what marriage is. And formerly, it was read at every wedding. So the priest would read this before the actual nuptial mass would follow. He would read it to the couple and to everybody present. And it's just a beautiful reflection on what we really believe about marriage. So, a whole variety of the things that I've said, I think, are summed up better and more eloquently in this. So what I wanted to do is just share that with you. And I think you'll see why I think it's so beautiful, okay? So this is that exhortation to marriage that many, many couples heard prior to their wedding, and some still do. Dear children of God, you are about to enter upon a union which is most sacred and most serious. It is most sacred because it is established by God himself. By it, he gave to mankind a share in the greatest work of creation, the work of the continuation of the human race. In this way, he sanctified human love and enabled man and woman to help each other live as children of God by sharing a common life under his fatherly care. Because God himself is its author, marriage is of its very nature a holy institution, requiring of those who enter into it a complete and unreserved giving of self. However, Christ our Lord added to the holiness of marriage an even deeper meaning and a higher beauty. He referred to love in marriage to describe his own love for his church and for the people whom he redeemed with his own blood. He thereby gave Christians a new vision of what married life should be, a life of self-sacrificing love like his own. It is for this reason that his apostle, St. Paul, clearly states that marriage is now and for all time to be considered a great mystery, intimately bound up with the supernatural union of Christ and the church, which union is to be its prototype. This union, then, is most serious because it will bind you together for life in a relationship so close and so intimate that it will influence and direct your entire future from this day forward. That future, with its hopes and disappointments, its successes and failures, its pleasures and its pains, its joys and sorrows, is hidden from your eyes. You know that these elements are mingled in every life and are to be expected in your own. And yet, not knowing what is before you, you take each other for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death. Truly, then, these words are most serious. It is a beautiful tribute to your undoubted faith in each other, that recognizing the full import of the words you are about to exchange, you are nevertheless so willing and prepared to pronounce them. Because these words involve such solemn obligations, it is most fitting that you rest the security of your wedded life upon the great principle of self-sacrifice. You begin your married life by the voluntary and complete surrender of your individual lives in the interest of that deeper and fuller life you are to have in common. From this day on, you will belong entirely to each other. You will be one in mind, one in heart, and one in affections. Whatever sacrifices you may hereafter be required to make to preserve this mutual life, always make them generously. Sacrifice is difficult and trying. Only love can make it easy, and perfect love can make it a joy. We are willing to give in proportion as we love. When love is perfect, the sacrifice is complete. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and the Son so loved us that he gave himself for our salvation. Greater love than this no man has, than a man lay down his life for his friends. No greater blessing can come to your married life than pure conjugal love, loyal and true to the end. Our prayer for you is that this love with which you join your hands and your hearts today never fail, but grow deeper and stronger as the years go on. If you allow true love and the unselfish spirit of perfect sacrifice to guide your every action, you can expect the greatest measure of earthly happiness that may be allotted to us in this vale of tears. The rest is in God's hands. Be assured that God will not fail you in your needs. God pledges you the lifelong support of his graces in the Holy Sacrament, which you are about to enter. So that's some of the way that the church thinks about marriage. I think it's a beautiful and rich vision, much richer than the sometimes impoverished view we get elsewhere. And it's a beautiful thing that we want to recognize for our own lives. If you are a married couple, that's a wonderful thing to want to dive more deeply into. And with all of the people we work with and encounter, we want to have this vision for them, that marriage can be something like what is described here, which will, in this life, will always be imperfect, but nevertheless a reflection of that great marriage of which we're all a part, which is Christ's drawing of the church to himself. Great to be with you, and thanks for all your good work that you do in the pro-life cause. Thank you all. Well, now you're getting to my territory, which is liturgical theology. So fundamentally, so after the Second Vatican Council, all of the sacraments were reformed in some way, right? So not only the Mass, but all of the other aspects of the ritual. So what I'm holding is the ritual book for marriage that's currently used today after the Second Vatican Council. If you have a nuptial Mass in what we call the extraordinary form, that would be the older ritual from which this exhortation is taken. So again, it sometimes is still used today. And of course, there's nothing keeping priests from either using this or drawing from it, right? So it's a beautiful reflection that comes out of the older ritual. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you find it somewhere online?
You can. If you just Googled marriage exhortation, maybe put in 1962, it should come right up. It's out there. Mm-hmm. Other questions?
With the reality of divorces and second marriages and things like that, with society, a lot of people, once they get to a certain age, unfortunately, people live together. But as a Catholic, how can you explain to someone the importance of getting married, even if you're not going to have children? Because that's a big thing. Even young people are deciding to live together because they're not going to have children because of climate change or something. So how do you explain to them that it's still important to get married, even if, especially older people, even if they're not going to have children?
Right. I think it's a great question, yeah. And I would begin by saying that, in talking about marriage, my thought was here, let's talk about what we really believe about marriage in its, most ideal form, right? So living in the real world, I'm not immune to the fact I realize that, right, we don't live ideal lives, and marriage never looks so ideal as we want it to, right? And that's even with couples who are able to stay together throughout the course of their lives, right? So it's often a lot more complicated than that. So starting from the ideal, I think, is a great place for understanding what do we believe about this thing, but then the practical reality is what do we do when things start falling apart, right? So I think one thing to emphasize for those who, they don't see necessarily the need, well, why do I need to pursue this? Or specifically, why do I need to pursue it in the church, right? Because there's actually a whole other crowd of people who will pursue marriage, but not as a church thing, right? And for them, I don't know, I think I might begin by trying to put into words that sacramental grace that's conferred, right? Because there's a real grace. The part where I'm saying it's not magic, but it's real. That God really, in his providence, gives us support. He gives us grace through this sacrament, just like we receive grace when we receive Holy Communion, just as we received an influx of grace for the very first time when we were baptized. There's something given to us in marriage that in holy matrimony that helps us to extend this throughout the course of our lives. I think I would just try and maybe speak to that reality that there's a good here that you're missing out on when you don't pursue it. That, life is going to be different. And even this exhortation gets at it. There are joys and sorrows. There's difficulties ahead. We don't know what they are, but we can guarantee that they're coming. And that grace is going to help you to meet those moments. So I think I might emphasize those things. And then with respect to the living together part, it's absolutely rampant. And it's for very spiritual reasons and for very practical reasons has been shown again and again and again in various studies that this is not a good thing. It seems to make sense that, if I'm going to get married, I should at least try this for like a little trial period, make sure this is going to work before I make the whole commitment. But all of the studies show that it's actually not true at all, right? So doing that leads much more commonly to problems and divorce than not having lived together. But statistics and studies don't usually convince hearts. So where I would begin is, and I know this sounds strange, but I would recommend, there is a great document. I wouldn't give a document to a couple, but I would read this document so that I knew what to maybe say. It's written by it was written some years ago, actually, by the bishops of Pennsylvania. Again, I don't often recommend bishops' documents to be read. This one's really excellent. It's really, really good. It was back in maybe 1998 or something like that. But it's the Pennsylvania bishop's letter about living together. I can't remember the title of the document. But again, that would come up. It's really good. And I think reading that can help us think through, well, why do we believe in a spiritual way that this isn't the best thing? And then once I've kind of ingested that, then I can be the person who witnesses to others. Again, we don't hand out copies of this. It's not going to be effective, right? But getting it into our systems and then being able to share it with others. And just the sort of bare bones response to it that I often try and share with couples is that, and just to say this, like living together does not always equal, but almost always equals sexual intimacy with one another, right? So we use that phrase, and sometimes we're just assuming that means that, so that's what I'm doing here, right? So a couple that's living together, let's assume that they're also engaging in sexual activity with each other. And what's so not right about that from a spiritual perspective is that the marital act is meant to be a way of saying with our bodies, I am entirely yours. I am making a total gift of myself. Totally unreservedly, I give myself to you. But of course, that's not actually the case when we're not married. When we have made that public profession of love that makes us a married couple, then we are capable of giving ourselves. But before marriage, we have not given ourselves wholeheartedly to them. And so what we're saying, it's actually a lie. We're saying with our bodies, I'm giving myself to you wholly and entirely, but actually, we're not. I'm only giving you some small part of myself, a very important and beautiful part of myself, but I'm withholding so much else. And so it's all built on, which really it's a gesture that makes that a lie, right? And so that just gets at the heart of what's so wrong about it and creates the problems later on, right? So again, in a very basic way, I think that's what the issue is. And I think by reading that letter, we can get a fuller understanding of where do we come from the spiritual perspective, that this isn't actually the healthiest thing for you. So it's a long answer to a simple question. But
I'm going to springboard off of her,
Yeah.
What she was saying. If couples go into a marriage and decide not to have children, now it's one thing if they can't have children, but if they decide not to have them, is it a marriage?
Yeah, so no, that's a great question. So let me read back the three questions that, or at least one of them, that have to do with what it is we're doing. So one of them is this: are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and to bring them up according to the law of Christ and His church? So that openness to marriage is a required element in a valid marriage within the church, right? It's the openness to it, even if there's a seeming impossibility, right? So even if this doesn't come to pass and they later discover that there's infertility or something like that, still it's the openness to this that it is absolutely required. And so a couple that would be coming to marriage and adamant that we don't want children, like that we can't move ahead with their wedding, because what they want is not the sacrament of holy matrimony. What they're asking for is not what the church offers. It's not what Christ offers. So that's a hard conversation to have, but it needs to be had, right? So as priests and deacons and others who prepare those for marriage, like, these are some of the questions, right? If most people can understand a little bit more easily that, if they didn't intend their marriage to be faithful, that would be a problem, right? That's one thing that culture still has, at least we think that that's a good thing. Again, it doesn't always happen, but we seem to have a sense that fidelity to one person, at least for this time while we're in the relationship, is a good thing, right? And if somebody didn't want that, a lot of people would be kind of repulsed by that. Well, he doesn't want to have a faithful relationship just with me. And we'd recoil at that. Well, again, because that's not what the church views as marriage. That's not what we offer. If that's what you want, you're going to have to look somewhere else. And similarly, it has to be open to life. And if that's not there in the couple, that's not what holy matrimony is within the church. So that's a great question. Other things? Great. Again, good to be with you. Thank you so much.